The world looks to California to answer the hard questions, for redemption, to introduce the unfamiliar, to be resilient. Because California bounces back, holds us accountable, values who we are, remains vigilant, defies those in our way, and stands for community. Here on the West Coast, we're at the center of it all. Los Angeles Times, the state of what's next.
Hey, Malcolm, you know that Audible's got a lot more than audiobooks?
Of course, podcasts,
Originals.
bestsellers,
Future bestsellers.
sleep stories.
Sleep story. What are you talking about, sleep story? Malcolm. Oh, wow. Malcolm. Malcolm. Hey, no, Roxy. Hey, Roxy, get out of Malcolm's house.
The most inspiring minds, the most compelling stories, all in one place. Audible.
Hola, welcome everyone. I'm Gustavo Arellano, the California Columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and also the host of a new podcast that we're going to debut on May 3rd called Appropriately Enough, the Times Daily News Podcast. Start subscribing now. Apple iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, all those places. But today we are going to talk, welcome, of course, and thank you for tuning in for the 26th Annual Festival of Books and this virtual event. But today we are going to talk about two of the most important subjects historically in California: incarceration and immigration. And thankfully here in the Southland, we have literally MacArthur geniuses who can speak to those two issues at hand, and also the intersection, the disturbing intersection in the past couple of years between incarceration and immigration. So we have to represent the schools, USC, UCLA, but I'm a Bruin, so we got to start off first with the Prophet Bruin. So thank you. Joining us is Kelly Lytle Hernandez. She's professor and Thomas E. Lifka Chair of History at UCLA, so go Bruins, and one of the nation's leading scholars on race, immigration, and the rise of mass incarceration. She's the author of several books, including City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles. And she won the MacArthur Fellows, that's the official name, but come on, everyone knows that, the MacArthur Geniuses. She won that fellowship in 2019 for her historical and contemporary work. Coming from USC, fight on, you got to represent, of course, Natalia Molina, PhD. She's a distinguished professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and her work lies at the intersection of race, gender, culture, and citizenship. So she's the award-winning author of multiple books, one of them, How Race is Made in America, Immigration, Citizenship, and the Historical Power of Racial Scripts. And she also wrote Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race in Los Angeles, 1879 to 1940. She too won the MacArthur Genius Grant last year in 2020. Before I introduce them though, once I bring them onto this virtual stage, please folks, buy their books. I'm here to remind you, you can purchase these books of Prophet Kelly and Prophet Natalia at our LA Times bookshop store. I know they're academics, and the stereotype is that academics can only write for academics. No, these are important, essential works about California history, but also about important subjects and just, disturbing yet engrossing reads. So please, please, please buy the book, support the bookstore, support the author, support all that stuff. Without further ado, though, to use that cliche, I want to welcome Prophet Kelly and Prophet Natalia. So welcome to the two of you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Oh yeah. California, we always are known as a place where you can see the future, for better or for worse. So I want to ask each of you in your respective fields, and then we'll get to the intersection of them, but how has California written the script for each of your respective subjects? So I'll start with Prophet Kelly. How has California written the script for how incarceration now plays out across the United States?
Well, that's a great question. So I would certainly take us back to the early colonial period here in California, the Spanish colonial period, and the mission system. Our colleague at UCLA, Ben Madley, who I believe actually won an LA Times Book Festival award several years ago for his phenomenal book, An American Genocide, he has written about how the corralling and the punishment and really the caging of California indigenous communities during the Spanish colonial period within the mission system constituted the very first example of mass incarceration here in Los Angeles. And at a per capita level, pound for pound, what Native peoples experienced during that period, during the mission period, was as intense, if not more intense, than what we've been experiencing here and across the United States for the last several decades in what's called the age of mass incarceration. So if we look at it from that perspective, California was a trendsetter when it comes to mass incarceration, but also the disproportionate disproportionate racial impact of that regime.
But I thought the missions were all about, barbecues and Spanish senoritas and orange crates and all that.
Yeah, that would be a mistake. So certainly the mission system was about bringing indigenous folks to Spanish culture, but namely Catholicism. It also used extraordinarily punitive measures and methods to get there. And so caging the body, punishing the body, whippings, denial of food, whether it be through trampling native and indigenous foodways or simply denying food within a mission, those were all methods that were used to force indigenous folks to accept Catholicism when they didn't choose to do so on their own terms. And it's that punitive impulse, right, that was really driven into the soil here. And I think you see it regenerated era after era through the Mexican period, and certainly in the age of Anglo-American dominance beginning after the US-Mexico War.
Yeah, and just as a reminder for folks, the mission system was set up before the United States officially became a country. So this is literally preceding the founding of the United States and embedded in the DNA of California, which spread elsewhere. And Profe Natalia, same question for you, but on immigration. How did California set the template, especially not so much for the phenomenon of immigration itself, but really the idea of immigration policy for the rest of the United States?
Let me pick up where Kelly left off, so kind of continue that arc. So Kelly talked about the punitive nature and punitive nature of labor. So we tend to think of the United States as, give me your huddled masses, and this is the land of opportunity. But if you look at California and the way that it's dealt with immigration, that hasn't always been the case, especially when you're talking about Mexican immigrants, Latinx immigrants, Chinese immigrants as well. So if you take a period not too long after where Kelly left off, the gold rush, right? The gold rush, this opportunity time. But it wasn't a time of opportunity for everybody. Not everybody could mine for gold. So you had restrictions for immigrants. You had things like that Greaser Act. You had restrictions for Chinese. And so, this was something that was really only available for white settlers to continue with. And then after the gold rush, as people were trying to establish other businesses, you saw ways in which, again, immigrants and even then the second generation were cut out of that workforce in terms of local policies that, denied them union membership, denied them areas of where they could live and work. And these were things that were both official and unofficial. So we also see the ways that there were local ordinances that sometimes reflected and then spurred action at the state level and even at the federal level. But then we also see that even if there wasn't a law, that things like vigilante violence, extralegal violence, lynchings were all accepted practices for keeping immigrants in their place. And these kind of local laws led to our first race-based immigration law, which is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So we think about immigration today, it's often framed in terms of Latinx immigration, but we see that our first race-based exclusion act was directed towards the Chinese, and that much of the practices of excluding them took place in the Southwest and particularly California.
Yeah, and not only that, this is not just back in the 1800s, going even to, just a couple of years ago with a movement against sanctuary cities or the sanctuary state in California. Racism is embedded in the DNA of the state. I would like to tell people this is the type of state that rejected Okies, white American citizens, and they still told them, we do not want you here for whatever reasons. And it's interesting because we're talking, we're supposed to talk about immigration and incarceration, and yet we're talking about two of the some foundational myths of California. That the mission system was so beautiful, that immigration, this was a land of opportunity for everyone. But we're talking about the flip side of it. How has California then been successful in hiding that shameful history from the rest of the United States? Because I don't think most people associate what we're talking about right now with California unless you're scholars about it. For either of you, both of you can answer, actually.
I'll start because I think Natalia has a stronger answer than I do. So I'll give you something short and dirty and quick. Certainly, we have to turn to the mega industry of Hollywood and the images that have been generated about life in the sunshine. But we also have to think about the construction of a historical narrative about what places like Los Angeles are. And that began very early, like I would say in the late 19th century, early 20th century, where, for example, on crate boxes, they'd slap stickers about the orange industry that showed you beautiful young white women plucking oranges from trees, not the fact that you had a racialized, marginalized labor force that was doing that work. And so the principle, the early industry around the growth of agriculture here in California had a image attached to it that was completely false, that had to do with whitewashing the extraordinary levels of suppression, labor control, and racialization that went into to its construction. So industry, business, Hollywood, all of those have played a significant role in whitewashing the narrative of the reality of how California grew so large, so strong, and in fact, so diverse that so many people have been recruited to California to perform those kinds of labor while being systematically marginalized within everyday social life. And on that, I'll turn it to my friend Natalia, who's done some of the most path-breaking work on how that's happened at the local level, in particular here in LA.
I'm reminded of this presentation I gave at the University of Houston a couple of years ago, and I was talking about this history, and there was this young African-American man sitting in the front row, the arms crossed, just looking angrier and angrier as my presentation went on. And so, when it came to the Q&A time, of course, I picked him first. And he looked at me in disbelief and just said, "How do I not know any of this history? I'm from California, I'm from Los Angeles. How was this never taught to me?" And there were two professors in the room, one of whom served on the State Humanities Board, and one of whom, Ro Ramos, who had written an op-ed about Texas and the Alamo, and had actually received death threats for it. And the one who was on the Texas State Board, had been part of protesting the kind of editorial editing done around Texas history course books. And while we don't have the resistance at that level in terms of editing our course books, we don't devote resources to it. We can see the fights around ethnic studies today that people feel they're so challenged by it. If you try to say, like, we want to teach this history, we see that the resources aren't devoted to it either. And so we keep being surprised that people don't know this history, and yet we don't do anything to remedy it. And, I think post the George Floyd protests, a lot of people keep saying, this is the start of something different. We can't go back. And Gustavo, your colleague at the LA Times, Carolina Miranda, just wrote this article on the Huntington Library, looking at its, how is it going to speak to these issues of diversity, and looking at its past in terms of what it has to contend with. And I looked at the comments for that story, and so many of them were like, "Why do we have to know this past? Let's move forward." Right? And it's like there's still so much resistance there. So there's resistance to ethnic studies. There's resistance to even talking about it in a newspaper column. So, it also says, how it begs the question, how will we move forward if we want to know these histories? One thing that, Kelly and I both participated in was the LA Mayor's Office just had a Civic Memory Commission. They just released the report. And
totally awesome.
That is something that, what if we start to build some monuments to this? How can we continue these conversations?
Yeah, it's a rejection of reality. I mean, everything that the two of you write about, it's history. It's all there. It's other people, the myth makers, who whitewash it. Going back to what Prof. Kelly said, especially when it comes to incarceration, Hollywood just basically was the stenographer for the Los Angeles Police Department for decades. Dragnet, all the different shows that we lionize as like brave, heroic cops going against bad people, was all because of Hollywood. It was all, meanwhile, under the Parker administration, and of course, Daryl Gates, we had one of the most brutal police departments in the United States. let's get into both of your origin stories. How did the two of you start researching and start getting into it? So I'll start with Profe Natalia. How did you get into studying about the history of immigration and with a specific angle on Los Angeles?
I am a Bruin also.
Yay, Bruins all the way.
I went to UCLA, and I think like a lot of kids of immigrant families, my family just said, be a doctor, be a lawyer. And even though I'd won a biology award in high school, I quickly got weeded out in one of those weeder classes. And then I was taking a history class with Brad Burns, who was somewhat of a UCLA legend, told me to go to grad school. Sandra Hale in women's studies told me to go to grad school. And so I started looking into it. And then I started working with Professor George Sanchez, who's now my colleague at USC and has a wonderful book on Boyle Heights that's just out. And I was living in Boyle Heights at the time, living and working in Boyle Heights at a spice factory. And I was really interested in how the freeways were built there. And so and since I was at UCLA has Edward Roybal, who was the city councilman at the time when the East LA freeway was put in, the largest interchange in the country, ends up leading to all kinds of health problems, dividing communities. And so I looked through his papers and was I've always been interested in both like what's imposed on communities and then how communities react.
Yeah.
And so I made copies of the people that protested the freeway, because there was also protests from Beverly Hills residents who had hired an attorney, and that attorney wrote in this beautiful letterhead and protested it. And of course, we know there's not a freeway in Beverly Hills, but there is one in East Los Angeles. And I thought, I'll go do interviews with these people. You had their addresses. So I went through Boyle Heights, and sure enough, all the addresses of the people who had written in, their homes had been razed. There was just the freeway there. So it really got me hooked on thinking about whose voices have power. How can we make more voices heard? When people talk about a place as, a barrio and have the stigma to the residents, do they think about where resources are put? And so that was my entree into it.
Yeah, and of course, the 710 freeway ends right there in East LA, never went up to Pasadena or even South Pasadena. You pioneered this concept of racial scripts. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So if we go back maybe to the example that I opened up with, talking about the Chinese immigration law, the 1882 exclusion law. So racial scripts are this idea that when we think about race, we have this stereotype about it. We have this narrative we talk about, but it's also often held up also by some structure, in that case, like an immigration law. And so those scripts are available to impose onto other groups as they come into the picture. And so we might think about, as we stop relying on Chinese labor and Japanese labor, and Mexicans start to immigrate in the early 1900s, in part due to the Mexican Revolution, they are subject to many of the same laws, policies, narratives that the Chinese were, because that script is readily available. And so, like today, when people talk about the anti-Asian racism that we've seen, and they often go back to like 1882, or they go back to Chinese on the railroad, or they might even, talk about like Japanese internment. But those scripts have been fortified, fueled by also the ways that we talk about other groups, including Latinx groups. And so it helps us think about, groups as devalued, as unworthy, as undeserving. And that narrative becomes so normalized to us that when someone has a racial epithet for referring to Asians or, the COVID, we don't really blink an eye. It's become so naturalized to us, and it's become naturalized by repetition.
Yeah, and sadly, California has been a springboard for a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment, specifically that is, at play right now: anti-Asian, anti-Latinx, anti-Muslim. Like you could trace back, and you've done a lot of, especially the work with Latinx, trace back in many ways sort of the origins of those specific xenophobias. Any response to that? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you did this great series, Gustavo, for Prop 187 for its anniversary. And I think, that is one of those. So we look at Prop 187 that says, undocumented can't receive any kind of public aid. I mean, if we break that down, we see that was really targeting women, children, Latinx group, even though they're just talking about undocumented, because most of those public aid resources are things like around health. They're around educational services. And so then now, we come to COVID times and people being hesitant to get the vaccine. And we're like, gee, why are these communities not rushing to get the vaccine? We don't have to go that far back of why they're not. And the structural resources as well. If we look at, if we compare East Los Angeles with, Palos Verdes in terms of their vaccination rates, we also see that kind of infrastructure wasn't put in place equally. And so these historical episodes that people don't like to think about and say, that's in the past, why are we thinking about it? Well, if we want to figure out how to solve problems today, we need to know why people are responding that way they are.
That old cliche, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And here we are. Profe Kelly, how did you get into studying incarceration? And a quick note to the readers, you also wrote a book about sort of, literally La Migra, the border patrol, which is, the monsters of incarceration on the border. So how'd you get into the subject?
Sure. Well, I'm from the border. I grew up in San Diego, California, and I grew up there during the 1980s and the 1990s. And it was a period of...
Back when Pete Wilson was God for everyone. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's perfectly fine. That's on point, right? So, there was very much a war on immigrants happening all around. There was also a war on Black youth around the war on drugs. And so I grew up in a place where I was watching and I was experiencing high levels of racialized violence. And for me, as a Black youth, I was experiencing, a considerable amount of getting taken out of school and sat on the curb and parties broken up and questions about curfew around the war on drugs and being a Black youth and being with my friends. And I'm watching at the same time what's happening for our brown folks, right? Latinx folks, in particular, people who are perceived as workers, who are brown-skinned, and they're being policed by the Border Patrol, right? And this is before Operation Hold the Line, Operation Gatekeeper, when La Migra was in our communities, was stopping people, pulling them off of buses, patrolling the transportation stations, the trolley and all of that. And so I'm experiencing racialized policing and violence, and I'm watching racialized policing and violence. And one of the things for me as a very, very young child that I noticed was that the boys in blue, the local police, would police the Black kids. The boys in green, which is the Border Patrol, would police the brown folks. And there was no Border Patrol policing of Black folks. And that was curious to me because I felt like everybody was policing us, right? Like teachers were policing us, everybody was policing us. And so I got really curious, really young, thinking, why did the boys in green not come for us? And why are they laser target on brown folks? And so when I got into graduate school, I wanted to unpack how race was working in the world of policing and everyday policing. What were the assumptions that were baked in and seemed natural? No one questioned what was happening in the borderlands during that time period, the beatings that were happening, the people disappearing in the middle of the night. No one questioned it. And I did. I remember asking my family, what is happening? Asked my father, I said, why did they police those folks over there? And he looked at me, and it was something in the tone of what he said. He said, because they think they're illegal. And the tone was, they're wrong. Nobody is illegal. What's happening over there is unjust. And I became extraordinarily curious about not just understanding that, but dismantling it. So yes, my first piece of work was a history of the U.S. Border Patrol and how it rose to be the second largest police force in the United States and why it became so-called legitimate, that they focused almost all of their resources on policing Mexicanos in particular, but now increasingly folks from Central America and coming across the southern border, and have from there expanded the work into race and policing and incarceration more broadly.
how do you study a big subjects like that, especially the way you call it, unspooling? Here you have, again, the boys in blue, you're supposed to respect them. The boys in green, well, you don't really think about them if you're not right on the border. Are you interviewing their victims? Are you going through reports? Are you reading any literature on it, if there ever was, that wasn't just, again, stenography?
Well, I was very fortunate. When I was in graduate school, I reached out to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and asked them what records they have from the old Border Patrol. It was established in 1924. So what records did they have from their offices and from their officers? And they said, well, we have a bunch of records, but we're not quite sure where they are. They're kind of lost in the back stacks. No one has asked for them before.
No.
If you come out here and find all the records, you can have them. For a graduate student, that's like, it's a treasure trove, right? So I got on a plane, I went to DC, and I was working in the back stacks, and I was pulling all the records that I could. And it's really all of their monthly reports, their call-in sheets, their memos back and forth from Washington, DC, their supervisors and the everyday Border Patrol folks on the ground. In addition to that, the Border Patrol has actually conducted their own series of oral histories with one another. And now these are incredibly rich because insiders tell insiders things they won't tell outsiders, Lord. Right? And so at the Border Patrol Museum in El Paso, they have a pretty significant set of oral histories taken with some of those earlier Border Patrol officers. And it's in those oral histories, you hear things about, yeah, well, we were smuggling folks on the side, right? They would never tell an outsider that. They're using explicitly racialized language that probably would be sanitized if they were speaking with an outsider. So I use those oral histories and much, much more, but those for the Migra book were really the base of the archival records.
What about for the LAPD book, for the history of incarceration in Los Angeles?
Thank you for asking that question. This is the best story.
Although, wait, I left one out of Migra. But if you want a good story, I'll give you a good story. So for Migra, one of the things I do in that book is I look at what's happening on the U.S. side of the border and the Mexican side of the border, because at one point there was a Mexican Border Patrol during the 1940s and 1950s, and I kept hearing rumors in the archives about this Mexican Border Patrol. So I went down to Mexico City and I was talking to everybody, the head of the National Archives, scholarly friends, students who are on the ground in the archives, and everyone says, no, there's no Mexican Border Patrol. You're never going to find those records. There's no such thing. Well, I was attending a conference. I've forgotten the name of the conference now. Nat, maybe you remember. It's a convening of Canadian, U.S., and Mexican scholars all together. And I met someone there, a scholar named Pablo Yankelevich, who works in Mexico City. And he had been on the same hunt for the records of the Mexican Department of Migration. And we joined forces. And it took about a year, but we found in Mexico City an abandoned warehouse where thousands upon thousands of records from the Mexican Department of Migration were being held under armed guard. And we were able to negotiate access to those records, get in. You'd go up to this warehouse, you'd knock on the door, someone would open like the slot and say, who are you? What do you want? I'm like, we're here to work with the archives. They'd open up this big metal gate and there'd be all these military dudes with giant guns guarding these records because they had all sorts of sensitive records in this immigration archive. And we had graduate students who under armed guard would go box to box to box and pull out the history of immigration control in Mexico. And good golly, what did we find? A whole bunch of Mexican Border Patrol records. And so I was able to tell the story together about how the Mexican and the US state worked together to control the mobility of Mexican workers in particular. So that's kind of like the first time I ever worked under armed guard to get some historical records. I got more stories. But the one about the LAPD, City of Inmates, the history of the rise of mass incarceration here in LA, I had submitted what's called a Public Record Act request to the LAPD, requesting all of their historical records prior to 1965.
Wow.
And they told me that they didn't have anything. They had maybe 4 boxes left, and they would go through the boxes. If I could tell them what they were looking for, they'd go find it and bring it out. Now, if you know anything about historical research, I can't tell you what I'm looking for. You got to go into the records and find what's there. So even the method that they proposed was something that was unworkable, but the notion that they only had 4 boxes of records left put a fire in my belly, right? You're not going to destroy this critical history. I'm going to go knock on every single door I have to knock on to find enough records to get in, back doors, side doors, come in a skylight, come up through the basement, whatever I have to do to get into the house of incarceration, I'm going to do it. So we went and we found records from the local court system, from public health, from education, all sorts of records. The newspapers were really critical in the writing of this book to chronicle the rise of mass incarceration here in LA between the Spanish colonial period and really the Watts uprising, but also right up to the contemporary moment. So when I'm working with graduate students, they often think, well, I'll go to the archive and I'll find what's there. And I'm often telling them, no, you got to go build your archive. Sometimes you got to sue to get access to the archive. You got to negotiate your way in there. And sometimes you have to confront extraordinary circumstances, such as decaying records that give you pink eye and all kinds of intestinal issues, which I have experienced. And it's hard work. If you want to find the voices and experience of marginalized people, their stories have not been prioritized in the archive. And so you got to go to unexpected places and you got to fight like hell to get access to what remains of their story.
No, that is such, I mean, both of your examples, literally knocking on doors, finding people, highlighting marginalized communities. That's great advice, both for academics and historians, but also for reporters. And this is what I always tell people as well, because you don't want to tell the stories that have already been told. You want to tell the stories that have never been told, especially those stories that have been suppressed by the powers that be. And there's so many stories like that all across California and especially in Southern California. Really quickly, Profe Kelly, can you talk about another project that you're involved with, $1 Million Hoods?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I run what's a big data project primarily at this point called $1 Million Hoods. And you can check it out at milliondollarhoods.org. And what we do is we map how much is being spent per neighborhood on incarceration in the local jail system here in Los Angeles. So on those maps, any neighborhood that's lit up in red is a neighborhood where we're spending more than $1 million per year, locking up the residents of that neighborhood in our local jail system. And the argument that we're making with the research and in collaboration with community partners is that if we took the money out of policing and incarceration and put it into the institutions and services that we know build stronger or thriving individuals, families, and communities, we would all be safer, we would all be healthier. One of the other things we do at $1 Million Hoods is we provide the only full public listing of what are the primary charges facing people in a $1 Million Hood or across LA County. And you'll see that in most $1 Million Hoods, there's 2 top charges: possession of narcotics and driving under the influence. Again, these are substance use related issues, health related issues. And if we took the money out of policing and incarceration and we put it into counseling, we put it into housing, we put it into jobs, we would build stronger families and communities. So that's the major work that we've been doing at $1 Million Hoods. But we also collect oral histories with community members who've experienced policing and incarceration. And because of a lawsuit that I was able to participate in with the ACLU against the LAPD, we have 177 boxes of historical material from the LAPD, largely from the 1980s and 1990s, that we're going through. I call it the war on drugs in a box, that we're able to begin to tell some of the key stories about how the LAPD operated and worked during the 1980s and 1990s. So when you take that all together, the big data, the oral histories, and the archives, we're using a lot of different methods to chronicle the fiscal and the human toll of mass incarceration here in Los Angeles, which operates the largest jail system in the United States, which cages more humans than any other country on earth.
MillionDollarHoods.org, folks, please check it out. We'll be getting to your questions in about 10 minutes. You, the audience, who have already submitted them. One of the questions I want to pose to both of Profe Kelly and Profe Natalia is, got to catch myself. The intersection then of incarceration and immigration. And we've been seeing this over the past decade, going back to the Obama administration, even under W, with these camps for children, for unaccompanied youth, with also holding adults all across the United States on the border. How does incarceration influence immigration, and how does immigration influence incarceration? So either of you who wants to answer it first, if you could answer that, and the great thing is both of you can talk to that. So someone take it first.
Sure. So, I think I'll connect that with one of your earlier questions and thinking about how the history of California has shaped these policies. So if we look at something like the Depression in the 1930s and the way that we had repatriations, right? Deportations of Mexican and Mexican Americans who were seen as unworthy, as economic, liabilities, and were sent back to Mexico, sometimes with their children who were also Americans. So we see this creation of categories of, public charges, who's unworthy, who's not likely, who's unfit to be a citizen, all these kinds of things. And those are the kinds of racial scripts that continue on. So when we look at the system today of, who's being sent back, who's being deported, it jives with the story that Kelly was just telling us about what kind of charges bring them to the attention of local policing as well as immigration officers. A lot of them are kind of petty kinds of crimes, jaywalking, substance abuse, all these different things. But they're also liable because it's hard to legalize their status. There's such long wait lists for it. And so we've created this system in which anybody who is trying to legalize is really in a precarious condition, a precarious state for years, sometimes for over a decade. And so that leaves them, vulnerable anytime that they kind of have any kind of interaction with the police. And, in the fall, I did this reading for this theater company in Denver, and they did this series called the Undocumonologues, where undocumented folks did a monologue, and then they had us read them. And we also, one of them was somebody who was talking about when they were a child, and just every time they took the bus home, if they saw a police officer, am I going to be picked up? When I get home, is my dad there? So you also see how just people live with that fear of deportability and aren't able then to become thriving, members of society in terms of work, in terms of schooling. When we look at something like DACA, the fact that, these folks have been waiting so long that many of them are in their 30s, 40s, they're doctors, they're essential workers, and yet they're still waiting. They're still like in this limbo, and then they're still paying to be in this limbo. And so, there are lots of stages there that when we talk about immigrant and undocumented, that it flattens out the way that the system has structured this group of, second class, people that can't participate fully in society and are always vulnerable to the specter of deportation.
And then, well, for Kelly, I'm thinking in the past really 20 years, the phenomenon of police departments allowing immigration agents to check the status of detainees in their jail cells, and also police themselves asking people about what their immigration status is. And please correct me, I'm sure I'm wrong on this, but I think the only good thing Police Chief Daryl Gates ever did was Special Order 40, which banned police officers from asking the immigration status of people that they came in contact with. So how have you seen then stuff like that emerging from California, then spreading across the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just want to go back really quickly to something that Nat said that's so important around the impact of deportability on people's well-being and their behavior, that kind of toxic stress for an individual and for a family impacts whether or not they can, for example, participate in their child's school. And all of us are harmed when members of our community feel so vulnerable that they cannot support their children, that they're feeling high levels of stress when it comes to raising their children. So especially their neighbors. For all of our communities that are living in areas that have high numbers of people who are undocumented, all of us are harmed by that status, and all of us have skin in the game when it comes to abolishing, I'll be quite frank with my language, abolishing the category of the undocumented immigrant in our communities. So I'm really glad that she brought that up and the importance of it. I actually want to flip this a little bit to talk about one of the most important intersections between immigration and incarceration today, and that is the criminalization of border crossings. In the United States today, in the federal criminal justice system, the number one charge or charges sending people to federal prison is one, undocumented re-entry into the United States after a deportation, which can get you up to 20 years in federal prison, given the specifics of the case. And two, the misdemeanor of undocumented entry into the United States. Now, those are the two charges, top two charges in the federal prosecutorial system today. And they are directly related to the history that Natalia had spoken about earlier, the anti-immigrant, but namely the anti-Mexican history. That those two pieces of legislation became law in 1929, and they were written by eugenicists, James Davis, who was the US Secretary of Labor, and by a congressman from South Carolina named Coleman Livingston Blease, are the two who brought this piece of legislation to the United States Congress. And their explicit purpose in 1929 was to what they call is shut the back door. That leading up into 1929, the United States Congress had been participating in an experiment of radical immigration exclusion, largely targeting non-white and so-called off-white immigrants, those folks from Southern Europe, but explicitly excluding all Asian persons from entering the country. And they'd run up against a barrier when it came to excluding Mexicans in particular, who were regarded as mongrel, as indigenous, part Black, mixed. And so when they came up against that barrier, they developed new techniques to control the entry of Mexicans into this country and in their minds to hopefully limit it. And I actually, I was reading an article earlier this morning reviewing something, and a scholar found a quote from this time period that is incredibly disturbing when you talk about the reasons why they wanted to attach criminal punishments to undocumented entry into the United States. I want to read that quote to you today. I actually never heard it before myself. But in 1928, in a committee hearing on one of these pieces of legislation that was intending to keep Mexicans out of the country, it was called the Box Bill, and Natalia has written quite a bit about this. The man who goes on to introduce the legislation in 1929, Coleman Livingston Blease, says the following: Mexicans are, quote, peaceably only in our own country. That is the reason, in their own country. That is the reason I want them kept out. They know when they get over here, they have got to behave or we will kill them. That is the man who introduced the legislation to criminalize undocumented entry and re-entry into the United States. That is the primary set of legislation driving people to federal prison today. Over 99% of those people are Latinx. We are living in the midst of 1929. We are living in the midst of what's called Juan Crow, Jim Crow. It has not gone away. It has not been excavated from our legal system. And I think for us as historians, I am constantly pounding the table, talking anywhere I can about the importance of abolishing, of stripping down, of wiping away this incredibly racist history that continues to set the terms of our lives and our possibilities. So I just wanted to share that with you all. Coleman Livingston Blease, look him up. He was a phenomenal, unrepentant white supremacist, and he is the person who gave us the number one piece of legislation sending people to prison today, federal prison today, namely Latinx folks.
And let me just
know your history, folks. Oh, go ahead, Natalia. Yeah.
I'll just piggyback on that just because it reminds me of something that you asked earlier, and I'm going to give you a different answer, which is, why don't people know this history? The other thing is this eugenicist history was no secret at the time. We tend to think of eugenicists as something associated with Nazi Germany and something that happened in some dark back room. But many of the eugenicists were leaders. At my university, we just renamed one of the buildings had been named after one of the presidents, von Kleinschmidt, who was eugenicist. We know there were policies that denied Jewish students, Japanese students at USC. We know that California had a strong lobbying organization, the California Commonwealth. We know that the owner of the Sacramento Bee was a eugenicist. We know that just so many of the local leaders were eugenicists. Here at Caltech, Paul Popenoe, they framed immigration laws. They framed agriculture. How to breed a better avocado, how to breed a better society. It just was kind of all within the same continuum for them. And just the other day, I had a neighbor knock on the door to ask me something, and it was the first time I met him, and we start talking. And I haven't figured out who yet because they're filming in the house, so the owner isn't there, so I can't ask her. But he said that one of the leading eugenicists was actually one of my neighbors, and that when our neighbors moved in a few decades ago, they actually found a few boxes of his things. So of course, like Kelly, I'm like, boxes?
Wow.
Do you have those boxes? But it's just so common. And that, the head of the LA Times, the Chandlers, they would also write into Congress and, talk about this labor that they needed, and they would frame it in positive ways, right? We want those indigenous Mexicans because they can work in 100-degree labor. So, these are open secrets. We are the ones who've chosen not to look at this history, not to acknowledge it, not to teach it, not to fund it, not to institutionalize it.
Yeah, really quickly, just to put into LA Times Festival books, if you read The Great Gatsby, even F. Scott Fitzgerald makes a passing reference to Madison Grant, probably the most famous eugenicist of that era, who wrote The Passing of the Great White Race. This is the upper class of society. They're talking about these issues. They're talking about these matters. And this is not ancient history. It's only 100 years ago, which is like a speck of dust in the continuum of time. Now we're going to get to the questions from the audience. And thank you all, those of you who submitted it. We only have about 12 more minutes, and we're going to try to go through a couple of them. So we're going to start with Gabriela. And this is more of a personal question for the two of you, Profes. How did you learn to keep learning and growing through the Trump era, assuming it brought hardship? So if any of you want to answer it, go for it.
I'll go ahead and start because, so.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Uh-oh. Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you, Natalia.
Oh, okay. I'll try that. The day after Trump was elected, we had gone to like a election party, and it didn't turn out the way we thought. And we realized, it was looking like he was going to win. And I remember we went to bed before we knew, and I woke up, and I went into my son's room. He was in middle school or high school at the time, and just kind of got up and what happened? And it just seemed like that very day things started to change. He was told by someone who, was somebody in our community that we really liked, but as a joke, that he wasn't allowed to touch this object that had the American flag on it. He wasn't American enough. My son is fourth generation now, through my mom's side. I got calls from my colleagues whose kids at school were being, third grade, second grade, were being told to go back to Mexico. So it started right away. I, went to breakfast a couple days later. I got flipped off by somebody. And so that is what actually spurred me to write my first op-ed. And it just became this way of everything we've been talking about. We know that while the Trump administration, was, totally, anti-immigrant and, a racist, we know that it didn't start with Trump. It started with all these things we've been talking about. So to me, it was really, and I think, to Kelly, it was really this clarion call to get out there and show people that even when Trump goes away, this is not going to go away. And that is clearly what we've been seeing. If anything, there's a renewal of verve into white supremacy today, which we see through anti-immigration policies, mass incarceration, through policing and through anti-Asian racism, anti-Muslim, right? It's this way in which it continues. And, Trump was only one manifestation of it.
Prophet Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, of course, my response was really, really similar to Natalia's and some of the experiences that I had. I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier and some of the mythologies that he was able to tap into with this "Let's Make America Great Again" slogan that he brought to the fore, which of course Octavia Butler completely saw coming, right? When you read her books. I was very concerned. Yeah, it's an eerie set of books about how sharp and on point that she was. One of the mythologies that's really important for us to dismantle is that we are a nation of immigrants. And I know I'm about to go somewhere that can be hard for some of young folks to hear, right? That we've held on to this notion that we're a nation of immigrants. We often use that as a slogan of include us, include us, include us, right? I want to lovingly tell you that is a lie. We have never been a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of settlers. There has always been a design in place to manage, to control, to harm Black and Indigenous peoples and non-white immigrants. This place was not constructed for all of us. It was constructed for a very narrow portion of people. And who and what Trump is he is like a settler on fire. And he stirred that hornet's nest so hard that I think we've got to start doing away the mythology, right? We got to stop lying to ourselves. We got to pull off the veil and talk about what this country really is. It's a nation of settlers. We have a shared enemy, right, that we've got to work against. Black, Indigenous, queer, non-white immigrant folks. We have to work together to transform this place to somewhere that we can live well, be safe, and thrive. We have never lived without constant crisis in our communities in this country because of the structure of white supremacy in particular and settler occupation. So he mobilized a lot of this mythology and was able to use some of it against us. And I think that we do ourselves damage when we mobilize the nation of immigrants as a notion, because it's just not true, right? If you look at the long history of immigration control and immigration law, it's a fallacy. And we have to be much more clear and targeted in our language and our politics about what it is we confront. And so I would encourage us to use language such as a nation of settlers. And that would help us, I think, set a program for dismantling and rebuilding a place where all of us can thrive.
Powerful, powerful words that, are going to be uncomfortable to a lot of people. Susana asks, it happens every day for some reason. AT&T, God bless it. What are you able to commit to doing in your current position as a MacArthur Fellow towards comprehensive immigration reform? So we'll start with Prof. Natalia.
The MacArthur Fellowship puts a spotlight on the work that we've already been doing and are already committed to doing. So that, it's wonderful to then be able to be part of a conversation like this, but then also to hopefully influence that immigration legislation. I know Kelly will have a great answer to this for the kind of legal work that she's doing, but, we're asked as, scholars, we're asked to do, commit to amicus briefs. So I think there's been like 4 or 5 that I've worked on. We're asked to, contribute to public policy decisions. Kelly and I am, please, Kelly, look it up if we don't know the name right now, have joined a collaboration of immigration scholars, both practitioners, journalists, mainly historians who have been working on this for a long, long time, that keep bringing these issues to the forefront so that people are armed with the tools that they need, lawmakers are armed with the tools that they need. We know that it is also a changing of the narrative, as Kelly was saying. So we work with K through 12 teachers. We work with community colleges in summer training workshops. Gustavo knows, we're always available for journalists who want to know this history. So, we're these, nerdy experts on immigration that want to get this message out to the public, and we are here to help in any way that we can.
Yeah, I would certainly
Kelly?
agree with that. And Natalia, you would ask for the name of the collective, the Migration Scholar Collaborative that we both recently joined, which is a marshaling of intellectual resources from across the United States to really confront some of the narratives, the negative narratives around immigration in this country today. Look, in terms of the MacArthur Fellowship, like Natalia said, it shines a spotlight on work that we've already been doing and commitments that we already have. And I would presume and I would hope that in some ways it's because of our commitment and because of the work that we've been doing to advocate and work alongside immigrant communities, but namely the most marginalized, the undocumented, the formerly incarcerated, Indigenous folks, Black folks. It's because of that work and the importance of it that we're doing in collaboration with community that MacArthur, which is undergoing its own process of expansion, of thinking about where important work is happening, recognized the labor of ourselves as individuals, but really how it's being done in communities, intellectual communities, and most impacted communities. I wake up every day to work on these issues. My principal commitments are to the movement to abolish mass incarceration and also to abolish immigration, the regime of immigration control, especially around undocumented status. And that's enough work in and of itself. So, for example, right now, I'm involved in a set of challenges to this 1929 legislation that is driving so many people into our federal penal system. And here I have to credit Cara Hartzler and other federal defenders out of San Diego and others who are working across the country right now to file a set of cases challenging the 1929 legislation. So I convene with them, I consult with them, I cheer them on, and I support them, and I provide expert witness to document the racist history of the 1929 legislation that's so pivotal to experiences of immigrants today. And it goes back to what Natalia said. In most cases, these are undocumented folks who are getting picked up somewhere in the country on a minor charge, a DUI charge or some kind of public order charge. And then it's discovered that they don't have status and that they perhaps have returned to the country after a deportation. They wanted to be with their families. They wanted to be with their children. They wanted to come back and get back to work. And now they're facing years upon years upon years in federal prison for that. And so I get up every day to do my best and do my part in dismantling those structures of oppression for our community members.
Incredible work. AT&T literally just kicked me off and I'm back here. So that means we're almost out of time. So closing thoughts, closing question for each of you, if you could just take 1 minute to ask. We talked a lot about how California has influenced negatively the rest of the United States when it comes to incarceration and immigration policy. How will California positively influence the issue of incarceration in immigration policy? So Profe Kelly first and then Profe Natalia.
Sure. Well, I encourage everyone to follow what's happening here locally in Los Angeles in the movement to end mass incarceration. You can check out the Los Angeles County Alternatives to Incarceration website and work that's been happening. The LA County Board of Supervisors has unanimously approved a plan, a scaffolded plan to not just reduce, but hopefully abolish our need for jails here locally. So I would hope that LA continues its leadership in thinking in new ways about public safety and demobilizing our dependence upon armed responses to community crises.
Profe Natalia, 30 seconds.
Certainly the response to COVID has not been a full success, but one thing that in our response to COVID is that we are changing the narrative of who's deserving of resources, of vaccines, of testing. When it comes to the undocumented, 10% of our workforce is undocumented, and therefore they deserve to receive, aid, even if the federal government disagreed. They deserve to know that they can get a vaccine, even if they, don't show papers. they deserve to know that they can seek health care if they receive COVID, if they have COVID, even if they're undocumented, that they should be able to feel safe not going to work. And I think California, Los Angeles has helped lead the discussion around that, because as we look to immigration reform, it's not just the legislation we need to reform, it's the narrative.
California has inflicted a lot of pain, but we can also give promise. So thank you both, Prophet Kelly and Prophet Natalia, for joining in this amazing conversation. For the audience, don't forget to check out LA Times Bookshop for their amazing books. Buy them, please. We hope to see y'all soon. There's a lot of other panels for festival books. Go check them out. Muchas gracias. Have a good day.
Peace. Thank you.